The walk stopped improving around month 6, the identical 30 minutes that once left you pleasantly winded now barely lifting your pulse at all. The muscle took longer to recover than it did at 40, a workout that once needed a single day of rest now demanding 3 or 4 before the soreness finally clears. Then the sleep got lighter. It broke at small sounds in the night that a younger version of you would have slept straight through. The skin repaired slower, a scratch or a scrape now lingering for weeks where it used to close over in days. The focus shortened, the deep, uninterrupted concentration of your 30s fraying and scattering by the middle of the afternoon, and the energy that once carried you cleanly from morning to night now runs out somewhere around 3 o'clock, leaving you reaching for a coffee you never used to need just to finish the day. Each one looks like its own separate problem, a fitness plateau, an age-related muscle change, a sleep issue, a skin issue, a focus issue, an energy issue, 6 separate complaints, each with its own name and its own tidy explanation, the kind a doctor might work through across separate appointments, one system at a time, each conversation sealed off from the others, but the systems producing those complaints share one thing underneath them all. One single molecule that every mitochondrion in every cell of your body requires. It turns food into usable energy, repairs damaged DNA, switches genes on and off at the right moments, and runs the 1,000 quiet chemical reactions that keep each of those systems working at all. A single molecule sits under all 6, not one apiece, and that one molecule has been declining inside your body since roughly the age of 40. By 60, on the measured numbers, it sits at about half of what it was at your peak. That is the kind of number that changes how you read your own body. The decline is real and it is measurable. It is progressive, worsening year on year. And it reaches every one of those systems at once, for the plainest possible reason. Every one of them is drinking from one shrinking supply. 6 complaints then. One molecule underneath all of them. And that molecule has been quietly draining since around your 40th birthday. Picture a large building with 6 departments, each on its own floor, all of them running off a single generator down in the basement. For years, the generator hums along at full output, and every floor has all the power it could ever need. Then, slowly, the generator's output begins to fall, drifting down toward half of what it once delivered. And so the floors start to brown out. The lights dim high up. The machines stall on the 4th. The computers reboot themselves on the 2nd. And on each floor the people do the natural thing. They blame their own wiring. They call their own electrician. They open up their own walls looking for the fault. 6 floors, as many service calls, as many separate repairs, all of them chasing a problem that is not on any of those floors, because there is nothing wrong with the wiring anywhere in the building. There is one generator in the basement, running at reduced power, and every floor above it is starving at the same time for the same reason. Your body is that building. The molecule is that generator. And almost nobody, doctor or patient, has ever once heard its name. So let me name it. Then let me show you how it powers all 6 floors, and then show you exactly how it powers every floor. And finally, at the end, why your body has lost the ability to keep it topped up. It is called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It is a mouthful, which is part of why you have never heard of it. On every label and in every textbook it goes by its initials, NAD, with a small plus sign that marks the electrically charged form that does the real work. Call it NAD for short. It is a coenzyme, which is to say a small helper molecule that other machinery cannot work without. It is present in every living cell you own, from the neurons firing in your brain to the cells lining your gut to the fibers of your beating heart. There is no cell that does without it. And its first and most fundamental job, the one it was doing before anything else on this list existed, is to move electrons from one place to another. That sounds abstract until you see what it powers. Everything your body does, every heartbeat, every thought, every step you take and word you speak, runs on a molecule of chemical energy called ATP. It is the universal currency of the living cell, the cash your body spends on every single action. It is also the currency that collapses within about 20 seconds of the blood supply stopping, which is why a person whose heart stops drops to the floor almost at once. When the ATP runs out, the body simply cannot pay for consciousness. Your mitochondria, the tiny power plants packed inside every one of your cells, manufacture that ATP on an assembly line called the electron transport chain. And NAD is the shuttle that carries the raw material onto the front of that line. It picks up electrons from the food you have broken down, ferries them across to the chain, drops them off to be turned into energy, and goes straight back for another load over and over, millions of times a second in every cell. It is a courier that never rests. Take the NAD away and the chain has nothing to run on. The assembly line stops. ATP production falls, and a cell that is short on ATP cannot hold its own shape, cannot build its proteins, cannot repair its DNA, cannot fire its signals. Starve it of NAD, and the entire cell begins to fail, quietly, from the energy outward. NAD, then, is the shuttle that keeps the energy line moving. But it has a second job, and this one is stranger. In this role, the molecule is spent outright, consumed and used up, gone for good the moment the work is done. Two families of enzymes do the consuming. The first are the sirtuins, a set of master regulators that reach into your DNA and switch genes off, silencing the ones that drive inflammation and switching on the ones that protect the cell under stress. Think of them as the building's quiet supervisors walking the floors, keeping the wrong machinery switched off. Every time a sirtuin silences a gene, it burns a molecule of NAD to do it. The molecule is gone afterward, spent like a coin and never returned. A second family are the repair crews, the enzymes known as PARPs, the emergency responders of DNA repair. They patrol the length of your genome looking for breaks in the strands, and when they find one, they rush to the site and patch it before the damage can spread. Every time one of these crews repairs a break, it too burns NAD. And not a single molecule, but a whole long chain of them, one after another, laid down like a trail of flares to mark the damage and summon help. So at the very same moment that NAD is being borrowed to make energy on the line, it is also being spent, permanently, on the constant background work of keeping your genes regulated and your DNA intact. The molecule is running the power line and feeding the maintenance crews, both together, every second of your life. It is the single most heavily worked substance in your cells, and it is the one almost nobody has ever heard of. This coenzyme powers everything, then. So the real question is how much of it you have left today compared with the version of you that existed 20 years ago. NAD falls by roughly half between the ages of 40 and 60, as Camacho Pereira and colleagues measured across the tissues in the journal Cell Metabolism. Consider what that means. In 2 decades, the supply that runs every system in the list drops to something like 50% of its peak. And the same fall has been traced directly in human tissue across the decades of a lifespan, in more than one lab, which makes it one of the more consistent measurements in the whole biology of aging. So the pool empties as the years pass. And the reason it empties comes down to a single enzyme with an awkward name, NAMPT, which you can think of simply as the recycler, because its job is to rebuild spent NAD back into working NAD. This recycler is the rate-limiting step in the entire operation, the narrow neck of the bottle through which all the rebuilding has to pass, as Imai Guarente established across years of mapping how the body keeps its NAD supply stocked. And as you age, your cells make less of it. The recycling slows, production falls behind. Now here is the cruel half of the arithmetic. And then, while production is falling, consumption is climbing. DNA damage accumulates as you get older, the slow buildup of molecular wear that shows up as changes in sun-exposed skin, and every one of those accumulating breaks calls out the repair crews, and every repair crew that answers burns more NAD. Well, the supply is being squeezed from both ends at once. Less is being made because the recycler is fading. More is being spent because the damage keeps mounting. The pool shrinks from below while the demand rises from above, and the gap between them widens every year. And so what began as a slow drift becomes, by your 50s, a shortfall the body can no longer paper over. Every system drawing from that shrinking pool now receives less. So which system did you notice first? For most people it was the walk, or whatever it stands in for. The exercise that stopped paying back the way it used to. That plateau in the walk has its own full story, the way a fit body simply stops responding to a stimulus it has fully adapted to. But sitting one layer underneath that story is the NAD supply. Remember that the electron transport chain, the assembly line that makes your ATP, needs NAD to feed electrons onto its very first station, a protein complex biochemists simply call complex 1. It is the front door of the whole energy factory, and NAD carrying its cargo of electrons is what walks through it. With less NAD in the cell, fewer electrons arrive at that door. The line runs slower, and each mitochondrion turns out less ATP than it used to. The machine itself stays perfectly sound, starved only of the shuttle that feeds it. This means that 60-year-old is asking those same mitochondria to power that walk with something like half the NAD they had at 40. The energy output per cell drops, and it drops everywhere at once because no tissue opts out of needing NAD, so the shortfall shows up in the legs on the walk, in the heart driving the blood, and in the brain trying to hold a thought. Exercise tolerance drops with it. The adaptation ceiling that ends the walk's improvement now arrives sooner, because the whole energetic foundation underneath it is running on a thinner supply. The walk plateaued for a second reason as well. The floor it stood on had quietly dropped beneath it. Notice where this bites hardest. Your brain's thinking region, the prefrontal cortex behind your forehead, burns more energy per gram than almost any other structure in your body, a furnace of a tissue that never stops demanding fuel. The part with the highest energy demand is the first to feel an energy shortfall. So the focus that frays by mid-afternoon and the tiredness that lands at 3 o'clock are, in part, your hungriest tissue running on the lowest NAD of the day at the tail end of a full day's spending. By late afternoon, the pool has been drawn down by every other cell that's spent from it since morning, and the most demanding organ you own is left reaching into a nearly empty account. Energy dropped because complex 1 received less of its shuttle. Where does the same molecule show up next? For most people, in the recovery. Building muscle has its own story too, the way effort signals the machinery that lays down new protein, but the repair that has to happen after that construction is a different job, and it runs on different tools. Clearing out the damaged proteins, keeping the mitochondria in good order, quieting the inflammation that a hard workout stirs up, all of that is the work of the sirtuins, those same quiet supervisors from before. And in your muscles, two of them in particular, working inside and around the muscle fibers, both burn NAD with every catalytic turn they take. They are supervisors that have to spend a coin for every order they give. So lower NAD means the sirtuins run slower, giving fewer orders per hour. Slower sirtuins mean the post-workout cleanup drags. The damaged proteins linger instead of being hauled away. The inflammation stays lit longer than it should, and more worn-out mitochondria hang around the muscle instead of being cleared out and replaced with fresh ones. Every one of those delays is a supervisor short of coins. And there is a second cost hidden inside the first, because one of the sirtuins' jobs is to protect the health of the mitochondria themselves, the very power plants that make the energy the repair depends on. So a shortage of NAD slows the repair and degrades the machinery that would have powered it, both at once. The person who bounced back in 48 hours at 30 and now needs a full 4 days at 60 is feeling exactly that. A cleanup crew trying to do identical work with far less of the NAD it runs on. The muscle keeps its core strength. The maintenance that keeps it ready is simply underfunded. Recovery slowed because the sirtuins receive less of their fuel. Energy and repair are daytime problems. What does the molecule do at night? NAD does not sit at a flat level through the day. NAD rises and falls on a daily rhythm, a tide that runs in step with your internal clock, higher at some hours and lower at others. The recycler NAMPIT is itself governed by that clock, switched up and down on a schedule, so the amount of NAD available to your cells swings across the 24 hours of a day, as Ramsey and colleagues showed in the journal Science. And here, the loop closes on itself in an elegant way. The sirtuins that depend on NAD are the very enzymes that help keep the master clock running on time, reaching in to tune the core clock genes that set your body's daily schedule. So the clock controls the NAD, and the NAD, through the sirtuins, helps control the clock. They hold each other steady, which means when NAD falls, that mutual grip loosens. Lower NAD means weaker sirtuin activity, which means a looser hold on the clock, which means a clock that keeps slightly worse time than it used to. And your sleep is built on the precision of that clock, the timing of your deep restorative sleep, the cycling in and out of dreaming sleep, the nightly rinse that clears waste from the brain. All of it depends on the clock firing its signals at the right moments in the right order. Loosen the clock and the architecture of the night begins to fray at the edges. The deep stages come a little shorter, the waking comes a little easier. That lighter, more broken sleep of later years may trace in part to this weakening loop, NAD feeding the sirtuins, feeding the clock. And here I want to be careful with you, because this is where the evidence thins. Each individual link in that chain has been established on its own, in its own experiments. But whether the whole chain, taken together, is a leading cause of age-related sleep change in living people, or just one contributor sitting alongside several others, has not yet been settled. The loop is real. Its full size in humans is still being measured. The honest thing to say is that it is one thread in the fabric, not proven to be the whole cloth. Its clock drifted because the regulator received less of what it runs on. 3 systems touched, one molecule falling under all 3. The 4th system reveals why the fall accelerates. Changes in the skin have their own account, the way your body's DNA proofreaders handle the damage that sunlight leaves behind. Down at the molecular level, one of the first responders to a broken DNA strand is a member of those repair crews. It finds the single-strand break and clamps onto it. Then it starts building those long chains that flag the site and haul in the rest of the repair team, spending NAD the entire time it works. The busier the crew, the more NAD it burns. At 40, the sums balance. The damage is moderate, the NAD is adequate, the repair crews patch the breaks, and there is still plenty left over for everything else the cell needs. By 60, the balance has tipped hard. The accumulated damage of 2 more decades means more breaks. More breaks mean more repair crews firing, and more firing crews mean far more NAD spent on repair alone, which leaves less NAD for the sirtuins and less for the mitochondria than there was before. The repair bill has grown, and it is being paid out of the same account that funds everything else, and that account was already shrinking on its own before the repair bill ever climbed, which is what makes the squeeze so tight. A falling supply meets a rising demand, and the 2 lines cross somewhere in your 50s. Now here is the heart of it, the piece that Verdine and, separately, Yoshino and colleagues brought into focus. The repair crews and the sirtuins draw from one shrinking pool, and they are now, in effect, competing for it. More NAD spent on DNA repair means less NAD left for gene regulation. Less gene regulation means the inflammatory genes the sirtuins would have kept silenced start speaking up. More inflammation means more oxidative damage to the tissue. And more damage means still more repair crews activating, spending still more NAD. Watch the shape of that. Look, it is a circle, and every trip around it leaves the pool smaller. The competition is a piece of the aging machinery itself, written at the level of a single molecule, feeding on its own output, each turn of the wheel stealing the very substance that could have slowed the next turn. Far from a harmless quirk, it is the engine of its own acceleration. This is the point where the whole picture changes shape. Up to here you have a list, 6 systems that happen to share one molecule. But now that molecule has 2 consumers fighting over a falling supply, and the fight itself drives the supply down faster. The list has become a loop. 6 systems, 1 substrate, 2 competing consumers, and a decline that speeds up the further it goes. Which leaves the last question, the one the title has held back from the start. Why can your body not simply make more NAD and keep the pool full? To answer that, you have to watch the recycling in motion, because your body salvages NAD down to the last fragment. It rebuilds every spent piece and sends it back to work, in a loop biochemists call the salvage pathway, and the name is exact, because the whole thing is a salvage operation running around the clock. Here is how the wheel turns. When a sirtuin or a repair crew burns a molecule of NAD, the molecule breaks apart, leaving behind a fragment, a leftover piece with its own name, nicotinamide. That fragment is the raw material for the rebuild. The recycler, NAMPT, grabs the leftover piece and converts it into a halfway product, an intermediate one step closer to being whole. Then a second set of enzymes takes that intermediate and finishes the job, snapping it back into a complete working molecule of NAD. The wheel has come full circle. The molecule is reborn from its own wreckage, and it goes straight back onto the line to be spent again. In a young body, this wheel spins fast enough to keep the pool full, no matter how hard the consumers draw on it. So the entire supply depends on one thing, how fast that wheel can turn. Now, the wheel turns only as fast as its pace setter, the recycler NAMPT. This is where the whole story finally closes, because NAMP is exactly the enzyme that fades with age. Your cells simply build less of it with each passing decade, and the reasons for that decline are still being pieced together, from the wear on the cells that make it to the shifting signals that tell it when to switch on. Here is the final twist, the one that makes the decline bite its own tail. Remember that when NAD runs low, the sirtuins go quiet and the inflammatory genes they were holding silent begin to speak up. That rising inflammation does something specific and cruel. It switches on a third drain, an enzyme that sits in the membranes of your cells and consumes NAD directly, and this one grows more active the more inflamed the tissue becomes. It has been measured climbing steadily with age, in step with the low-grade inflammation that age brings. So the picture completes itself. The low NAD lets inflammation rise, and the rising inflammation opens a fresh drain that burns NAD faster still, which drops the NAD lower again, which quiets the sirtuins further, which lets the inflammation climb higher. The shortage feeds the very thing that deepens it. A third mouth opens on a pool that was already draining from two. Because this one enzyme sets the pace for the entire rebuild, its decline throttles everything downstream of it. The wheel turns slower. The raw material is still there, the spent fragments still waiting to be caught and rebuilt. What thins out is the machine that catches and rebuilds them, year over year, so more and more of those fragments drift away uncollected before the recycler can reach them. Less NAD is rebuilt per hour, even as the consumers keep burning through it at that same rate, or faster. And that gap, the space between a rebuild that is slowing down and a demand that refuses to slow with it, is the decline. That gap is everything you have been feeling. So is the body simply failing here, giving up as it ages? The opposite is true. The body strains at the recycling the entire time, working as hard as it possibly can, with a crew that shrinks a little every single year and falls a little further behind every single day. The effort never stops. The effort is just no longer enough to break even. And that is the thing you were never able to feel directly. The reason all 6 changes arrived looking like strangers to one another. You cannot sense your NAD sliding downward. The drain is silent. No ache. No warning light says the coenzyme is low, and the pool is emptying. No organ reports its NAD level to your conscious mind the way your stomach reports hunger, or your skin reports cold. The molecule simply thins, quietly, in the dark, across 20 years. No alarm ever sounds because the body was never built with a gauge for it. What reaches you instead is every downstream consequence of the drain, and each one arrives on its own, in its own time, wearing its own separate disguise. The energy fades in the afternoon, and the recovery drags on for days. The sleep thins and breaks before morning, the skin mends slowly, the focus shortens before the day is even done, and the low simmer of inflammation that should have stayed, switched off now, quietly runs. 6 sensations, 6 disguises arriving years apart, each one convincing you it was a separate story with a separate cause. And underneath all 6, one molecule falling, the same generator in the same basement dropping toward half output while the floors browned out one by one and blamed their wiring. A separate electrician called to each floor, and not one of them ever went down to the basement. The molecule you have never heard of is the molecule that every system you have felt changing has been quietly running short of, for years and years, without ever once telling you its name. The walk plateaued and the muscle recovered slower, the sleep lightened, the skin changed, the focus shortened, and the energy faded by afternoon. 6 systems and 6 conversations you may have had, with 6 different explanations. One molecule underneath all of them. NAD, the coenzyme every mitochondrion requires for energy, every sirtuin requires for gene regulation, every repair crew requires for DNA repair. It declines by roughly 50% between 40 and 60, while every system that depends on it keeps right on drinking from the shrinking pool. The decline is measurable. The consequences are felt. The connection between the systems you assumed were aging separately is the shared substrate they all run on. The molecule you never measured is the molecule every system you noticed changing has been running short of for years.